Greetings and welcome to episode 28 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation. Now, we've been through Genesis and through a lot of Exodus, and what happens now in Exodus is they're wandering in the wilderness, and that theme runs through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and into Deuteronomy. So in some ways, it's difficult to kind of summarize all of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a summary of what Leviticus and Numbers is about. In this episode, that's usually where people quit reading the Bible. When you make your resolution in January, I'm going to read through the Bible this year. You get through Leviticus, all of these codes for living and everything like that, and you just kind of give up. So by the end of January, generally people are done with reading the Bible when they read it that way. So we're going to summarize Leviticus and Numbers. Next episode, we're going to look a little bit at an episode of the snake on the pole in Numbers 21, because Numbers also includes some stories about the wilderness wanderings. Episode 30, I'm going to summarize for you what went on in Deuteronomy, what's really in there, and then we'll talk about the death of Moses at the end of that episode, episode 30. So, Leviticus and Numbers. Really, what Leviticus and Numbers teaches us is about holiness. About holiness. Let's take a quick journey through these two books of the Bible, Leviticus and Numbers, that many people find it difficult to read. Reading plans generally stop at this time. And yet, these two books of the Bible, Leviticus and Numbers, are powerful truths about holiness and worship and obedience, and again, trusting God in the wilderness. Leviticus shows us how a holy God teaches his people how to live. Numbers shows us what happens when people struggle to trust God along the journey. And really, when you have a bird's eye view of Leviticus and Numbers, you really see that they point us directly to Jesus and how we should live today. So let's talk about the setting for Leviticus and how the people are learning how to live with God. Israel is wandering in the wilderness. They're given 40 years of wandering. That will be an important number that we'll see in a couple of episodes when we get to Joshua. God had delivered God's people from slavery in Egypt and now was forming the people to live in a relationship with him. They're no longer slaves, but now they are covenant people. And it raises the question, how do sinful, rebellious people live in relationship to a holy God? That is a question that the book of Leviticus answers. Because Leviticus focuses on holiness and worship. God gives the people of Israel instructions about sacrifices and priests and worship and moral living and community life, all with one primary purpose: to teach them how to live as a set-apart people from God. One of the key verses is Leviticus 19. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Holiness simply means being set apart for God. We'll talk about that more also. Israel was called to lead different lives from the nations around them, not because they were better, but because they were people of God. So the sacrifices in Leviticus were all a part of the system. When people sinned, sacrifices allowed them to come before God and acknowledge their need for forgiveness. But the sacrifices were always a signpost pointing this way and pointing forward. And all of the sacrifices in Leviticus foreshadow what Jesus would one day do when he sacrificed and gave himself for us. So you could kind of summarize the laws and interpretations of those laws in Leviticus that can be summarized by saying, be honest, be fair, care for the poor, be care in the way you treat people, work for justice and compassion. Don't lie, don't steal, don't exploit people working for you, and love your neighbors. In fact, Jesus makes reference to Leviticus 19:18, where Leviticus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said the same thing when asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, well, there's kind of two of them, love God and love your neighbor, because God cares about how we live every day. God cares about holiness, which shows up in the way in which we speak to people, the way in which we treat coworkers, the way in which we handle money, the way that we respond when no one is looking. So that's Leviticus in a vast summary of what goes on in that book of the Bible. Numbers kind of recounts how they're going through the wilderness and tells us the story of how Israel journeyed through the wilderness on the way to the promised land. They don't come into the promised land until Joshua, okay? Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Moses dies, and then Joshua leads them into the promised land. The big lesson that they learn in Numbers is trust. Because they're going through a difficult time in the wilderness. They face hardship and fear, and again, God delivered them, even though they complained about the food, even though they complained about Moses' leadership, even though they doubted God's promises. When they're in the wilderness, it was a time of testing. Remember, we talked about the difference between testing and temptation. Testing comes from God to draw us deeper. Temptation comes from the devil to draw us away. So it was a place of testing, but it was also a place, the wilderness was, for the people of Israel, a time of formation. And God provided for them in incredible ways, manna from heaven, water from rocks, guidance by the cloud and the fire. And even when the people struggled, God remained faithful. And, you know, people today still experience wilderness times. Have you ever gone through a period of time when you just kind of felt in the wilderness? You didn't experience God very much. Where is God? All the stuff that I'm going through. When my prayers seem to be unanswered, when the future seems to be uncertain, when life is just difficult or confusing, Numbers reminds us, the book of Numbers reminds us that God does not abandon God's people while they wander in the wilderness, because our wilderness, their wilderness, this is a difficult lesson, that sometimes times in the wilderness makes your faith stronger. Sometimes difficult challenges, death, divorce, whatever that might be, hospitalization, sickness, wilderness times, sometimes those wilderness difficult times can be places when we can trust God even more. That's a difficult lesson to learn. I wish trust in God would be something that would be easy. But when God wants you to develop patience, God doesn't give you, an island and a cool drink in your hand and a barbecue. God puts you in the DMV line at 4 in the afternoon. When God wants to build a character trait in you, sometimes you're placed in the complete opposite place that character trait is one that you want to learn. When you want to learn trust, God sometimes places you in a time when trust seems most difficult. So what do Leviticus and Numbers teach us today? 3 brief lessons. 1, God cares about holiness. God cares about not only our belief system, but in the way in which we are transformed. Remember one of our key verses. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you might be able to discern what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. By the renewing of your minds, sometimes desert experiences bring us into a place where there's nothing we can do, where God puts us between a rock and a hard place, or at that geographical cul-de-sac before they cross the Red Sea. Sometimes faith is not just about belief, but it's about transformation. God calls us to lead lives built on integrity, compassion, humility, and faithfulness. Holiness is not about perfection, but it's belonging to God and living in a way that reflects that faith in God. And that also leads us, the second lesson is to trust God even in the wilderness. Life has difficult wilderness seasons, moments when the path seems unclear, and Numbers reminds us that God is still leading us even when the difficulty, even when the journey is difficult, because the same God who led the people in Israel still continues to lead his people today. And so the third lesson we learn is to live as God's people today. Live with forgiveness, restoration, new life. Through all of that, God does guide and God does remain faithful to us because God provides, God forgives, and God continues to form God's people. So Leviticus and Numbers kind of can seem like ancient wilderness books filled with law and strange stories. But when we really look at it with a bird's eye view, the message becomes clear. God calls God's people to holiness. God walks with us in the wilderness, and God eventually delivers us. So those are important lessons to learn in Leviticus and Numbers. So now we're done with them. Now we can continue through after those two difficult books of the Bible. We'll look at the time in Numbers 21 when they complained against God, and then we'll look in Deuteronomy, and then we're on to Joshua. It's been great to be together in this episode and continue just to make it a great day. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.